Oh, sorry. Yeah, it's like
Oh yeah, that's kind of.
So what have you been doing? I was there too.
Had a lot of coffee.
Oh, did you like? How do you like the responses you got back?
I thought they had like some of the stuff. I feel like prejudice things. Obviously, I don't want to put it away.
I felt like we were asking questions. I always try to be aware.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that weird subsection of industry is or less easily make it other countries make the space that's all I
Concerned about the way she does a lot. Oh, and another side, oh, but it's not this. Yeah, it's like, but I'm playing mine, so I'm not playing mine. And then later on, she's like, oh, I'm a feminist. And I'm like, oh,
yeah, for sure. It's gonna be a conversation. It is a lot.
it's so hard to find something.
I'm also going to be doubling. I was also.
Oh, right.
Hi everyone, so we're just going to get started. I'd like to welcome everyone for the fuck are all the Asian American women, asterisk. Thank you all for coming out. My name is Jennie. I'm from Wesleyan University. I'm a philosophy and feminist gender and sexuality studies with a theory certificate, double major. And I am a junior this year.
Hi guys, I'm Heidi. I'm a junior at Williams. I'm a bio major.
Hey y'all, I'm a senior at Middlebury College. I'm a gender, sexuality, and feminist studies major.
So we're going to get started first with rounding out some community standards. So community standards basically are just like the foundational, like, I guess, rules or guidelines that we want to place down so we can have like an efficient and safer space to talk about all these issues. So first of all, we would like to point out, like, assume good intentions. Like, there might be some very charged things that are said, and we all say shitty things from time to time. So just assume that it's not coming from a place of malice. Assume that it's just like, you know, the person's, they might not have said it correctly or in the way that they intended. And then, do you want to?
Yeah, so make it, take it. I think a lot of you know as like step up, step back, but it's a less ableist version of it. And so it's like make space and take space. So be aware of like a lot of times in the room, like men tend to take up a lot of space and they speak a lot, and like white people tend to speak up a lot. And so just being
And
aware.
East Asians.
Yeah, and East Asian, like light skinned East Asians. So just being aware of like who's speaking up a lot, like who hasn't, whose voices are we not hearing, and also like evaluating like who's not in the room right now. I think is also really important. And like I'm not really sure what acknowledging that does, but I think it's really important to acknowledge it. Yeah. So if anyone has any other community standard that has worked for them.
I think something that we talked about was also like there might be differences in the sort of backgrounds that we're coming to this conversation with. So if there's something that like you would like clarification on, or there's a word being thrown around that you're like, wait, what is that, or something like that, feel free to like bring that up and ask questions.
Alright. Does anyone have any other community standards that they would like to add?
Misogyny will not be tolerated, as well as other forms of oppression, but yeah.
Alrighty. So we're just going to start getting into the topics. My original priority with creating like this kind of panel was on Fresh Off the Boat. I don't know if everyone has seen it or like knows like the basis like understanding of it, but Fresh Off the Boat is like the first all Asian American family like sitcom on network TV. And so it's been getting like pretty good reviews, and a lot of like Asian Americans and like a lot of other POC are like rallying behind it because it is like one of the only forms of Asian American presentation on network or like in the media. And so in that aspect it's great. But from what I have watched, which was like the first like 4 episodes, because after that I couldn't really handle it as much. But within the first 4 episodes, I just felt an enormous amount of misogyny and chauvinism and just objectification of women that I couldn't handle watching the show anymore. For example, a lot of like what the jokes are about is on assimilation, and the littlest boy, he's apparently like the most assimilated, but assimilation in that form is through his ability to like be with girls, like pick up like other like I think it was non-white girls. Yeah, non-white girls, as if like
They make sandwiches for him.
Yeah.
You did start off with white girl.
Oh, yeah. And so basically, in order for him to be assimilated into the American culture, it's him being able to like have women on both arms. And then another one was just like the mom is kind of like just kind of cornered most of the time and just kind of shut down for a lot of like the talks. Hello. And so that's something that I want to talk about. Does anyone else have any like thoughts or feelings on like Fresh Off the Boat, or like if they felt anything like similar?
So I watched like a bit of the first season, and the one thing if you were seeing with the mom, like also the premise like of the whole story is like based on like the perspective of like just like one of the kids. Just because like a young boy that's like through his eyes. Like there was an episode where there's like a hot like neighbor, and it's like the wife of she's like much younger, and like he like makes a big deal about how he used to like hug her in front of his friends, and he like touches her ass or something. And so it was really uncomfortable, and I was like, you're like supporting or like you're showing interest of like Asian Americans, like while developing it. And like I feel like you can't do both of those simultaneously. Like you can't support, like you should be able to support, and like you can't support one and like put women down at the same time.
Sorry.
I feel like there's also like with especially the treatment of the mom, it's like this like kind of this like tiger mom trope, but also just the like she's so uptight and she's always so unreasonable, and the dad's like, oh, it'll work out, and like most of the time that is what happens, and it's just. I mean, like often like her concerns are pretty legitimate. Like, yeah.
Also the fact that she like works from home and like no one expects her to like do anything besides just like be like a housewife.
Has anyone else seen the show? No. Yes. Do you have any thoughts or feelings?
I agree. I think it's a mixed bag. Very complicated. Step forward, one step forward, two steps back kind of thing. You know what I mean? And I think it's like who is it? Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, right? It's like replacing the oppressor's face with our face, and somehow viewing that as success. It's very strange.
Also, regarding this though, I have a bit of a question in terms of, because we know that this is sort of an adaptation of a memoir, of a book, and that's an adaptation of your life in the first place. But to what degree, because it is made for like mainstream TV, to what degree is it like these decisions are based off of like the misogyny of the industry and blah blah versus the misogyny of like Asian culture in the first place? Because that's like a real thing, like paternalism, and you know, like to what degree is it like they're telling the story, and the story initially itself is, you know,
Yeah, because I know Eddie Huang, who it's like kind of based off of, like he doesn't watch the show.
Yeah.
Because he's really upset at how like they like basically fucked it up, and like not that I'm surprised entirely.
So, Harry, did you want to add something?
well, yeah, I feel like it's also insofar as it's telling a story of like kids like trying to assimilate. Like American culture is really sexist. Like a lot of assimilation does involve perpetuating misogyny. So like. If it, I feel like if it was painting some like much more egalitarian, rosier picture, like would that be really true to the experience of growing up in the 90s and wherever they are in Florida?
Because I feel like that's part of why the show is realistic, because you do see these interactions between your parents growing up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, on your comment on like it reflecting like the industry is like a business, and like the industry kind of reflects us. Like they're giving us what we want to see, and not to make money. So like even though it does reflect the industry, it like simultaneously affects us, and like we're doing it wrong too.
I would actually say that maybe we think it's what we want to see, but I think it's also a reflection of what like white corporate America wants to see. So it's, I think, a reflection of values that are kind of always simultaneously thrown upon us like every day of our lives, that we are so used to it and kind of want to see it.
Yeah, and like there's only one example, right? So like I expect, and I don't really like watching football, but like I watch it and I expect it to be everything for me. But obviously that's not true, because we don't expect the same of like a sitcom with like a white family. We don't expect like one show to be representative of like every single family, but we expect it. And like that's not just for shows, but in life, right? Like we expect like one Asian person like to represent everyone, and like
I will also say, I remember reading about Eddie Huang saying that he didn't watch the show, but from what I remember, it wasn't more or less that they adapted it poorly in his like own mind. It was more that they picked like a South Asian like woman to adapt it, and he was like, how can a South Asian woman like correctly like portray my own experiences as like an Asian man? And like it also like borderline very, very sexist like remarks, like, oh, like this woman can't do my like experience like correctly, because obviously like she obviously doesn't have that experience, but just more or less was like undermining women's ability to be in this like field, or like ability in the general sense as well. Yeah.
I feel like we've been discussing this show with a lot of people who like advocate for sexism as part of like the genuineness of Eddie Khan's experience. Like, what do you expect from a 12-year-old boy? Like they kept saying that to me, like saying like it's been adapted from his memoir and like adapted from this particular moment in his memory when he was like just starting to like start puberty and his dad gave him that sex talk and like he was listening to rap music for the first time. It's like of course he wants to touch like the hot blonde neighbor lady's butt. Like that's just like a part of your consciousness when you're this age. Like they're just being very defensive of the show. Like when I was a boy that age, I was also having these kinds of sexualized thoughts and blah blah blah. And like you need to understand that about my experience. But like I just couldn't help but feel like no one should be subjected to feeling that comfortable watching TV. Like I know this, but I also like that was my personal thing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, I don't watch the show, so I don't know like exactly how these like jokes come across. But I think there is a way to like accurately represent like the misogyny that was part of his experience, but also like do it in a satirical way, or not like put it through a lens that like we obviously see that's wrong, and that's the joke, versus like haha women aren't they like horrible? Like that's like yeah.
Also, it's just like modern family with like Jennie and Luke, like they don't deal with like any of those kinds of things. And they have like kind of like an innocent like American like experience. You never like think about these kinds of things, and I mean it was just like overcompensating and like trying to appeal to a broader audience.
Jennie's like super religious, but I've also like watched a lot of other religious things. I don't know. Yeah. And
I don't want to cut you off. I think it's interesting because like you said, this is one of like the only shows with an Asian American family, and I just wonder how successful would a show that did not over-exaggerate misogyny and certain like social issues, a show that didn't over-exaggerate these things, how successful would it be? Because that is like another thing.
Yeah, because in order for an oppressed group to be validated, they need to be validated by another like privileged group, being men. And in order for Asian American men to be validated, they needed to be validated by men.
Yeah.
And so if they're not showing that they are also like sexist, then they're not being validated as well.
It's tricky. Not that this is a good thing, but it's just
And that's so harmful, right? Like I'm always thinking like at whose expense? Like I feel like patriarchy affects everyone, right? And like obviously it affects like women a lot more, and like I'm very like not about like we need like male feminists, like I'm really not about that. But I think like I don't know what I'm trying to say. Like I think I get really frustrated when people say like this is the reality, this is how it should be. Like no, it shouldn't be that way. And I think that's where my frustration comes from, because I know like you can go next. But I know like a lot of my friends like at Middlebury, I hate it when people say like, oh, it's okay that Middlebury is oppressive because like our entire society is oppressive.
Right.
And so I was like, I think Middlebury, I don't know about any of y'all schools, like I feel like they have enough resources and power to like make like Middlebury as an institution, like it's a small enough space to make that into like safety is a guarantee, but safety as a goal, and like it's not happening. And I feel like we expect it to not happen because we've been brainwashed to think that it can't happen.
Yeah, I guess I wonder, because I mean, it like I talked about, it's really important that it's like actually representation of Americans. But like, I don't know, we're watching it and we're like, okay, this is uncomfortable, but like we're also in this environment where we're able to have these conversations. Like I wonder for like, you know, like 10-year-old kids, like what's the trade-off? Like, oh, like maybe something resembling your culture is represented, but then it's also super. And like I feel like it could go both ways, that like maybe not having any representations is even more harmful, given that like misogyny is ubiquitous.
I mean, people say it all the time, right? Like it's no representation better than like bad representation, or like vice versa.
I don't know. I haven't seen the show, but it seems like this way of thinking about it as representative of any Asian American experience in its totality is also totally distracting, because I'm thinking about your comment about like replacing an oppressor space with like yellow watching an oppressor space in some ways, but also like using that as like a way to not think about I guess like reiterations of a nuclear family, reiterations of an American dream, the suburb, and like how do you think about Asian American feminism when you're not thinking about like things outside of just like, oh well they're all Asian, so that's how we are going to think about this like show, as opposed to like what are they trying to do with the show, I guess, and someone brought up like white corporate intentions, but I guess like maybe from like thinking about feminism on a deeper level, like what does it mean to represent like a nuclear family? What does it mean to, how do you really like queer up the patriarchy in a way that is successful? And I'm not sure if like, oh, they're all Asian is like really helpful in like thinking about it. So I've been avoiding the show.
Yeah.
But
Well, actually, if anyone saw the last episode, clearing up this show is like really interesting. It was
Would you like to give it
the worst. It was like the mom's like high school. Did anyone else see it?
Oh yes, that
The mom's high school boyfriend comes back and she's like, oh my gosh. And she asks her husband, like if he can come, he doesn't really care. And the whole time she's like, why don't you care? Like, why aren't you getting more jealous? And she keeps on like pushing him, like, we're gonna go and like, you know, watch a movie together, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, all right, go. And then she asks him, like, why aren't you getting jealous? And he's like, don't you know? Like, he's gay. And then the whole episode starts to unravel and it's like just super problematic.
So
and like
the husband met the friend at some
the
point?
husband met the friend and it became this like, the punchline was that like the boyfriend, the ex-boyfriend was like really into her husband the whole time. And he was like super flamboyant. He was like gonna try out for like Aladdin on Ice or something. It was just like a lot of like putting queer people in like this box, especially like Asian queer people. That was just bizarre. But if anyone saw that, it'd be fun to talk about.
I feel like it's like, yeah, like that portrayal and like just the whole thing earlier in the season with like the misogyny, the patriarchal portrayal, it perpetuates like the emasculation and hyper masculinization of Asian American males, which is very problematic, you know, like previously in the media, like the Asian American male was like portrayed as just emasculated, you know, but then like they try to portray like Eddie's experience growing up in a very hyper-masculine like narrative, which is very problematic, and then to portray a queer male in this way is also, it's just, that's horrible.
I teach a class at my school on with my friend Alton Wang, who's in the next panel, about Asian American gender, sexuality, and history. I do the gender and sexuality portion. We were just talking about how Asian American men in our society are feminized, are emasculated. And I would just like to ask, like, the group, is emasculization a real oppression, though? Because aren't women just feminized? So if you're saying that you're feminized and that's oppressive, what are women then?
Worse.
So like the biggest insult like
Yeah.
for a man is like being a woman.
Yeah,
Right?
to be feminized. And when you say that you don't want to be emasculated anymore, aren't you just trying to like regain that male privilege, that heterosexual, heteronormative male privilege back, like asserting your dominance over women?
yeah, such a binary and like so transphobic in a way. Like if you're thinking about it as like, what does it even mean to be like a feminized man? Like what attributes make you feminine? And I think it, for, I guess like, I don't know, I'm assuming that it becomes about like a empowering Asian men by using like femininity as a way to think about like lack of power. But yeah, it just doesn't sit well with me, especially with like the like imposed like trans reading on like on this in maybe like with colonial undertones of like we're saving their women from like their like men who aren't men. So
You had your hand up. No,
Oh.
I didn't mean to put you in the spot. I know you had your hand up earlier.
Oh, I was just
Did
gonna, I think you already mentioned it, but I was gonna say like that notion that like why are we like just that of asking, like what does it say when we're asking like is it a bad thing that like, you know, this notion of like the emasculated Asian man, like why do we think of that as like a negative thing? And I totally was just gonna echo that like it sounds to me like it's built off of like very like cis sexist, you know, notions of gender.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anyone have any thoughts on this?
I I just
Sitar and
think, like,
lettering.
I don't think like, I just think like the problem with masculinization, it's not like the masculinization itself, but the reaction from like Asian American males. Like they like have to assert their dominance and like be overly male to the point where they're oppressors, and that's not okay. Like that's
Yeah, essentially the same thing. That like I don't think that having a negative reaction to someone imposing like a gendered identity with you on you is a problem. Like yeah, like the fact that society gives Asian men a very narrow role to play is fucked up. But that the response is like, oh, don't emasculate me, rather than this entire binary is messed up. Is like that's when it becomes problematic, because then the response to a form of oppression becomes even more oppressive.
Yeah. What's your name? I just want to echo what you said.
I'm Harim.
Sitar.
I just want to echo what Harim Sitar said, and I really, from what you said, like the reaction from Asian American men are really important. So then I guess it brings up the question: what would be the most sort of powerful and challenging normative discourse on just the gender binary and just Asian American identity in general? Like, what do you think would be the most powerful sort of reaction that you would expect? Just like, I think it's just like personal for everybody, because I think everybody have different opinions on that. Like, does that mean that the acceptance of me being emasculated the most powerful thing you can do, and then by accepting it and giving it a new sort of like rhetoric, a new meaning of what being emasculated mean or being feminized means? I don't know, just pose a question, what do you think would be a good sort of reaction?
Well, someone came to my school this past winter and gave a lecture on his new scholarship. He's a Southeast. I think he's rooted in California, but he does a lot of work on Asian queerness. And he gave this lecture. I forget the name. I don't remember, but it was like something called like Asian bottomhood, and it was talking about Asian men reclaiming agency and being like the bottom, because in a lot of in a lot of porn, Asian men are the bottom, like they're the receptive bottom. And this talk was kind of trying to like take away like the perceived shame of that, so that Asian men could enjoy their sexuality without these sort of like binaries. It was really, really interesting. But I think like I get a little confused about these things, because it still like centers the agency on these men who are oppressed. And it like, I don't understand, like I get frustrated by the thought of people needing to conform to these systems of oppression. And having that be like the way to break out of it. I understand that it's necessary, but I still get like I don't know if that like takes away the focus a little bit.
Oh wait, I'm sorry. I just want to add that this person might be Vivian, who wrote A View from the Bottom.
I can look it up actually. If you guys have a
I
question.
don't remember reading this article about if you view pleasure from the lens of a person in the position of objection, then it might be that the person enjoys actually being in that position, which also strikes me as problematic because it conforms to the framework instead of challenging it.
Yeah, I was just thinking like, what we're concerned here is representation, then why are we talking so much about demand, how we want to be represented, versus how we can be on the supply side and be in control of that production, and what are sort of like the system in terms of discouraging Asian American to be the producer of content. Like, in the mainstream also, like, I feel like online give us a lot more power, which is why Asian American have popular on YouTube, but why aren't we talking more about, producing that representation?
Okay, so the scholar, I can't pronounce it. Okay,
Spell it for us.
Nguyen, that's the first name, and then the middle, TAN, and then HOANG, with like various like pronunciation like markings, at Bryn Mawr College. The lecture was called Bottomhood is Powerful. I'll just like read 2 sentences on like the summary of the lecture. But it says, this presentation examines the ways that anal erotics and bottom positioning refract the meanings of race, gender, sexuality, and nationality in Asian American visual culture. I argue that bottomhood simultaneously constrains, there's a typo in here, that bottomhood simultaneously something and constrains Asian American men in moving image media. Conceived as a sexual position, a social alliance, and an aesthetic form, bottomhood affirms a politics that embraces race, risk, receptivity, and vulnerability. So, yeah.
That's just calling it.
Wait, this is not that hard. Well, I guess I think something that's really interesting that I've been thinking about, I only watched the first couple of episodes of what's fresh off the boat, but the way that the like class narrative is wrapped up with like the model minority stereotype and but also like gender things, like but so like when it comes to masculinization, it's like the entrepreneurial immigrant is not only a bid in this instance is not only a bid for like masculinity, you know, like the male is the head of the household or whatever, he has to like be economically successful, which it like plays into model minority things, but also reads as like this sort of like bid for whiteness or like acceptance through the, you know, through like conventional means of economic success. And it was interesting that there was an episode where the is it her sister, the wife's sister? Yeah, her sister comes, and so there's this like pissing match between the two couples over like who's richer, and yeah, they're both like really materialistic and like obsessed with success and like the trappings and like material wealth. But it's connected, it's like intimately connected to like ideas of masculinity and femininity and like how the roles are.
Absolutely. You also have an anecdote on representation and tactile representation. I don't know if you want to bring that up now or if you it's a thing that you brought up in my class. Tactile representation or
Tactile, oh god. Wait, I'm not going to talk about this.
Okay. That's fine, that's fine. You had your hand raised?
Sorry, I should shut up at one point. But I just wanted to add on to that. This competition of masculinity is very much contained within this Asian family. It doesn't really exceed those boundaries, and I think it's interesting because if we look at a history of Asian American growth in this country, it very much is rooted in Asian American men being a part of America's service industry, which is a typically like very feminized thing. So they're in like cooking, they're in cleaning, and we see that continued on in Fresh Off the Boat, like he's a restaurant owner, which is where a lot of this like gendered construction of like Asian people comes from.
So enough about men.
I'm glad you're
Yeah, alright, okay, I'm glad I wasn't the only one.
So, if it's okay to move on to something that's related, but not exactly directly, something we were talking about when we were conceptualizing this panel was like specifically Asian American feminism and what that looks like, because there's a degree to which culture has to play a role in the feminism that we practice, and just wanting to bring that up to open it to some sort of discussion.
I can start. I mean, for me, I'm grappling with the American part because I'm like not from this country, but I'm like still a U.S. citizen. So like I know that I will be looked as like American when I go back to Korea, but like I also want to reject like United States. But I think recently, it's not kind of recently, like I realized that like I was perpetrating like violence against like Asian women to be in solidarity with everyone else. So I felt like I couldn't say like I'm an Asian feminist, like my priority is Asian women, because I felt like that meant that I was ignoring other women of color, like other marginalized bodies. But then I realized like that's so, like I fucked up because like Asian women are not liberated, like queer Asian women are not liberated. And so why did I feel like it was selfish and wrong of me to like claim like Asian feminism or like to be an Asian feminist. And so I think, yeah.
Does anyone have any ideas of what like Asian American feminism could even encompass or mean?
Or any struggles when you're trying to figure that out?
Struggle has been like looking at canonical Asian American activist texts and like they're blatantly misogynist in some ways, so thinking specifically of Frank Chen. And I just like don't know how to do that because it's like, oh, we're reading it and it's part of the canon, like this is the AA canon. But like I don't know how to include the canon, so like is it canon?
Does anyone know anything about yellow fever?
It says fuck you yellow fever on my Tinder profile.
Yeah.
Does that actually work?
What?
Does that
No,
actually
well,
work?
also like, I'm very selective about my swipes.
Oh, there's
I haven't encountered anything yet.
There's just a shout out. This girl at my school recently graduated. She started a blog called Two Asians and a Selfie Stick dot square. What is it called? Squarespace. .com. Take a peek. It's all about like profiling misogyny on Tinder and about these like about being harassed by these men just on a daily basis without even trying. So she has some of them funny, some of them depressing, some of them inspiring. It's good.
Yeah. So like one form of like Asian American women, like feminism could be about like yellow fever because that's not directed at like black women. That's not directed at white women. That's a like very Asian American specific thing. And then on top of that, there are other forms of like feminism, like Asian American feminism that has to do with just like not even just how women are treated, but how the queer people in general, Asian American queer people are treated as well, as seen as some like homogenous thing, especially since like the men are also feminized for the most part. We're all just seen as some like enormous like blob of just like, I don't know, queerness, but not even like really like weird. Go ahead.
I guess I was just wondering, maybe for me, Asian American feminism always have a more personal connotation. And I wonder why it was more like a big thing about like Asian American group as much as it was about black feminism back then. Like probably part of it's because of timing that was like happening at the end of second grade. And it happened at the time, so it made it more like a national thing, but I don't know why. For me, Asian American feminism is so personal in that way. Like why can't we make it a more like entire race thing? Or is it because the Asian American women identity is so, I guess, culturally integrated by other races as well? That's part of the question. But like for me, like I always think about like how I can demystify what it means to be an Asian woman, and that's what my feminism means for me. But I don't know how I could do it on a more broad.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I want to add something on your thing that I saw some cases, I didn't see many cases about Asian American feminism, feminist activities, but I saw some cases that some Asian American feminists judged by what they are, not because of what they do. So I want to add, like, it's not from like every single Asian American family probably, but I saw some cases that they couldn't even get support from their own family because they're like, oh, women should be like women, like ladylike, blah, 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 those things. So because like some Asian American culture are still stuck in like 1970s, 1980s, I don't know, I just feel like a little weird when I saw that, especially Asian American people, like feminists, judged by what they are, not what they do.
It's true. I think, yeah, so like identifying as women of color is very political for me. So it's not a racial identifier, and I think if you look at like the foundation of women of color, like it was in a very political sense. So it means that you're committed to like ending and fighting oppression, and not because you're a woman and of color. And I think that's what I mean when I say like I'm an Asian feminist. I'm like, yes, because I'm Asian, but also because it means that like I'm for like, the liberation of like Asian communities and Asian people, which like also means like tackling like anti-black racism, also means tackling like other systems of oppression that perpetuate and it intersects with like like Asian racism or like racism and sexism.
For me, I feel like Asian American feminism means that means two main things for me, which is changing the demographics of a white-dominated like feminist movement, and the second one is trying to challenge the stereotypes that Asian American women have to deal with. So it's not just from the white culture, but also from a lot of Asian men as well, Asian American men. I find like a lot of times, even in my Asian American community, like there are these stereotypes I have to deal with, like being docile, not speaking out. And I like struggled with that even in college. I'm a freshman. I already like encountered it quite a lot, especially being in a relationship with like an Asian American man who has all his like friends who are just like him. So it's like, weird being in an intimate situation with someone who's so associated with the people who are oppressing you in a specific sense. So yeah.
Does anyone have any final thoughts?
Well, I think, I don't know, I think I was talking to you and I was talking to other people about like, I have very little like, I know very little history about like Asian feminism or just like Asian histories in general, and like a lot of the histories I know is like post-colonialism or like post-US imperialism, and I realize that like a lot of people who do have a lot of knowledge on these like have PhDs, and so what does it mean? Like PhDs are very like elite, like it's a very elite like profession, like big careers, and so what does it mean to like value these forms of knowledge that have very negative consequences for communities like my communities, which like poor immigrant like communities of color, right? And so I don't know, I think it's really complicated, but like right, and like I think I have a responsibility of seeking it out too, but then seeking out also becomes really hard because like in high school or whatever, you learn a paragraph about like the Japanese internment camps. So like there you go, like you should be satisfied, we represent you in our history books. It's like,
Well, thank you all for coming and discussing with us. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thank you, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.